So let me sort of give you an overview of what we're going to do today and what we'll do for the rest of the month, because it's I was going to say it's kind of hard for me to believe. It's actually very difficult for me to believe that April is almost to an end. And we were looking at the schedule, I was scheduled to talk about World War One today. Well, from a chronological standpoint, and I really am sort of a chronological historian. I tend to like things to fit together. And I realized that I needed to do the progressive era, and then we will do World War One next Tuesday. And then with that last session in April, we're going to then adjourn for the summer, because as I'm hearing from so many of you, May becomes busy with graduations and end of school, but also with things going on. And my hope is I'll see all of you on Friday, May the 6th at the Armed Forces Day Parade, but there's just so many things going on in May as we begin to prepare for summer that then we will come back in mid-August and start again when life begins to go back to normal. So the progressive era, it's an interesting time to talk about, because the truth of the matter is the progressive era, just saying the progressives, is really kind of a huge generalization, because what you're going to find, or what we do find as we look back historically, is that pretty much all of the beginning of the 20th century is an era of business expansion. We've talked over the last 2 or 3 weeks about how the nation began to change following the Civil War, and that included the expansion of industry, the expansion just territorial wise, the addition of states, the impact of big business on personal lives. And out of a lot of that will come the progressive era, which includes a number of different progressive reform movements. Not everybody in each reform movement was involved in other reform movements, but sort of a basic way of defining what the progressive era and the progressive movement is those people who were progressives identified themselves as working to make American society better, a safer place to live. They wanted big business to be more responsible to their workers through a series of regulations that we'll begin to have. They wanted to clean up corrupt city governments. The end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century was sort of the era of the Tammany halls and the big machines that controlled politics. They were also concerned about working conditions in all areas, about what living conditions were like, especially in the larger cities, but also in the rural areas, because of the lack of, I guess, what we would call amenities of life that you might find in the rural areas, the electrification, which will come much later. And then you'll find also that they're concerned about the environment. In the early days of being concerned about the environment, of course, they're concerned about water quality, but they're really concerned more, and in many ways led by Teddy Roosevelt in this, is conservation of resources. There also is a huge movement that begins as a part of the progressive movement about the expansion of the right to vote. And, I think we're so accustomed today to the fact that women vote that it's easy for us to forget that, 100 years ago, women had just achieved the right to vote. And what so often we forget is that Native American people did not get the right to vote until the late 20s. So, some of this will occur pre-World War I. Some of it will be accelerated by the conditions of World War I. But we're going to sort of kind of take a look at all of that and move ourselves through how some of these movements began to occur. So let's take a look at the next slide. And the next slide, what were their objectives? And when we look at those objectives, what was the origin of this progressive movement? And, if we really think about progressivism, the objectives of the movement really began to occur almost immediately following the Civil War. There was this recognition of the spread of slums as we had a much larger number of immigrants coming into the country, being brought into the country, assimilating into the melting pot. that the rapid urbanization that tended to occur in the last quarter of the 19th century created a lot of problems. You know, there was, in many people's mind, an exploitation of labor, not something that was a new issue, because the same thing had been said in the 1840s about the Irish coming in, and you know, the fact that they were often paid what would have been substandard sorts of wages because they were desperate for work. But it becomes accelerated even more in that last quarter of the century. There's also what we begin to find is a division politically that is much stronger in that last quarter of the 19th century. You're going to have sort of a breakdown of democratic government in a lot of the cities and a lot of the states, because you have within the political parties these political organizations that, you know, the rapidity of being able to communicate with each other, whether it's telegraph or whether it's, you know, the rails or whatever, you have people who get involved in politics because of particular business interests, and you have a push toward financial and industrial consolidation. And we talked a little bit about that when we were looking at, you know, the Henry Fords and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and others who were involved in that. But you know, out of all of these things will grow movements for reform, both at the local, state, and the national levels, and they're incredibly diverse. Some of the earliest movements are going to have to do with the Grange, the agrarian movement out in the Midwest. It's going to have to do with the Populist Party, and even the Democrats under William Jennings Bryan will include in their platform a number of things that could be considered to be progressive sorts of things. It's also a period of time where, you know, our economic system is based on the idea of Adam Smith, laissez-faire. Man is governed best when man is governed least. And if left, capitalism, if left to his own means, man will work in his own self-interest. And as such, everyone benefits from that. Well, by the late 1890s in particular, and Andrew Carnegie is one of these proponents of what he says yes to laissez-faire, but he includes with it something that he will call the social gospel. And that's the idea that those who have much have a moral obligation to assist those who have not benefited by the system. So this begins to sort of change the way that people look at society. You know, the truth of the matter is, from the beginning of the Puritan movement coming into Massachusetts in the 1620s, up through mid-19th century, there was often, if not vocally announced, this assumption that if people were poor, it was because they didn't work hard enough, or they were just destined to be poor, that there are always those who are going to be wealthy and those who are going to be poor, and such is the way of life. And that was just how sort of society was preordained to occur. Andrew Carnegie in particular, but along with a number of others, will begin to sort of look in some of those dark corners of our life, and they will talk about the need for reform. So a lot of things are going to begin to change during this period that we're talking about with the late 19th century. So if we go to our next slide, let's talk a little bit about the political kind of proponents, because, you know, for something to become a very active part of our nation, often what you're going to have are those who are going to support it. And Teddy Roosevelt is such a unique person in our history. When you look at him from a political standpoint, even from a military standpoint. So, you know, what happens is by 1901, the reform upheaval that's going on, whether we're looking at, you know, Jane Addams and Hull House, you know, caring for immigrants, education for children of the factory workers, all those sorts of things, to, you know, women becoming much more vocal about the right to vote, to those who are going to talk about temperance, and we'll take a look at that in a moment too. But there was so much upheaval going on that you couldn't contain it within state boundaries. So much of what we talk about well-being of life from a constitutional standpoint, voting, health, education, all of those are issues that are not a federal mandate according to the US Constitution. all of those are issues that are controlled by the states. The states control, the requirements or have historically, where the voting will occur, the credentialing of voters, all those sorts of things. They also have always been in charge of health issues. They were in charge of education. And what we find by 1901 is the issues within those types of movements have transcended the state boundaries. More and more, there were those who began to believe that the only way that there were certain problems that could ever be addressed was going to require federal government involvement. And you have these people saying it's the federal government's responsibility to help work together for a solution, because even if progress is being made, let's say in New York, when Teddy Roosevelt, has served there as governor, what about those kids in Mississippi, or what about those kids in Idaho or wherever? So we have to have, the belief is a strong beginning of a movement that there are certain issues that become federal issues that go across those states' lines. Historians believe that McKinley possibly would have ignored much of this rising tide, this public opinion of federal involvement, because it was not a particular area that he was interested in. But the fact that he is assassinated and Teddy Roosevelt comes to the White House, and Teddy Roosevelt, 42, youngest person ever to serve as president. John Kennedy's the youngest one ever elected, but Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest one to actually go into the office. He comes into the White House and he has this high level of energy, and he has, he is a Republican, but he has broad, what he would have said, humankind sympathies. He had been police commissioner in New York City. He had been governor of New York, and he's one of the first presidents to really have sort of an insider's knowledge of what life was like in an urban setting, because no city was more urban at this point in 1901 than would have been New York City. So you've got Teddy Roosevelt becoming president. You have Congress controlled by a group of more conservative Republicans. So he's going to be forced to work with the Congress, but he really is going to take on the issues that progressives are interested in. Most historians agree that by 1906, Teddy Roosevelt is the undisputed spokesperson of the progressive movement, and he is by far its most effective publicity agent, because as he often said, I have a bully pulpit, and why would I not use it if I'm president? Why would I not use the office of president to advance what he saw, the story of humankind? And one of the other things too, by his leadership of public opinion and the fact that he could be a spur to Congress if he chose to, or he could be their friend, he is able to revive the power of the presidency. We had gone through a period, if you really think about it, for those of you that love presidential politics, from the time that Ulysses S. Grant becomes president, and Grant, bless his heart, was not himself a bad president, but he had he was expert at choosing all the wrong people to surround him in the presidency, to serve as his major advisors or to lead his organizations. And we go from Grant, you start looking at the 1870s, Rutherford B. Hayes, you come through the 1880s up until McKinley's presidency. And within presidential political history, that's known as the age of the powerless presidents. None of them really stand out as being outstanding presidents. That's a terrible thing to say, bless their hearts, makes it a little bit better. But if you think about it, Garfield, Cleveland, you can toss all sorts of names out there, and none of them are particularly strong presidents. What you're going to find is that Teddy Roosevelt will begin to bring back to the presidency the power of the presidency. Now, that can be seen as being either really, really good, or it often by Congress will be seen as being not so good. Congress would ever remind Teddy Roosevelt that Article 1 of the Constitution creates the national legislative body, the House and the Senate, because the power should rest in those two bodies, because they are the voice of the people. The president had often been a less powerful figure, but Teddy Roosevelt is really going to push the presidency into being the most powerful force in national politics because he does have that bully pulpit. So he's going to take on a number of issues, and we'll talk about some of these in a little more detail in a few minutes. He is particularly concerned about trust. He doesn't like vertical integration, which is something that you will see the oil companies, you'll see the steel companies doing. That's where they are able to purchase everything from the actual ore, the mines, all the way up to where they're able to produce the finished product. He doesn't like having very little competition. He doesn't like these sorts of industrial groups that get together because he sees them as steadily increasing the prices, and that's making it much, much more difficult for the average American citizen. It will be Teddy Roosevelt who in 1890 actually will help, and he's not vice president at this point, he's not president, but as governor of New York, and then as just an active proponent of this progressive movement, will help push through the Sherman antitrust. And in fact, he takes Cleveland on about that. And then he becomes very angry with McKinley when he feels like McKinley's not going to enforce it. And that'll be one of the major efforts. He will also, begin to look at issues related to agriculture, production of food products, all those sorts of things that he thinks have a negative impact on the average life of the average citizen. We're going to find that during that period of time, it's going to be really interesting as to how he will handle the progressive movement, and then what we're going to see following him, because he is much, much more interested in what's going on in that area than perhaps you're going to see with some of the other presidents we're going to take a look at. In fact, let's take a look at the next slide, and we'll pull up we'll kind of get a time frame and look at William Howard Taft. You see Taft to the left, Woodrow Wilson to the right. Teddy Roosevelt will finish out McKinley's term, and then he will be elected on his own in 1904. Now, he could easily have been reelected in 1908, but he had made a political promise that he would serve 2 terms and then he would be out. So he serves his 2 terms, and then he chooses his friend Taft to run for the presidency. By the way, if you want to read it, John Meacham has an absolutely wonderful book on Teddy and Taft that looks at their relationship, looks at their friendship, and then looks at the division that will occur between them, because of course Teddy Roosevelt, Taft will be elected with Teddy's endorsement in 1908, and then Teddy will become incredibly disillusioned because he doesn't see Taft taking charge and doing the things he wants him to do. So that in 1912, of course, you're going to have Taft running for re-election. You'll have Teddy Roosevelt running on the Bull Moose Party, and you'll have Woodrow Wilson, who will be running on the Democratic Party. And as so often happens when you have one party with 2 candidates, a 3-ticket presidential candidacy, Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, will win. So let's talk a little bit about Taft and Wilson, and then we'll look at some of these particular movements that will occur during the reform movement. In some ways you have to feel sort of sorry for William Howard Taft. I mean, Taft is obviously not the physically active. He's an intellectual. He's the only person who will serve as president. And then once he leaves office, will actually become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court a little bit later. So, the man's cerebral. He's this great scholar, but temperamentally, he's not what we normally think of as a president. He certainly has a difficult time following someone like Teddy Roosevelt, who had been so much larger than life. I mean, I think we all have these images of Teddy striding across, the landscape of this country and advocating for national parks and all the things that he does, and, carrying the big stick and being, a foreign policy, getting the United States on the world stage, as we talked about last week. And Taft is really sort of an introvert. He's a conservative, but he's not particularly dynamic. He is, most historians look at him and consider him to be somewhat inept, indecisive, I guess is the appropriate word, and that he had difficulty figuring out how to lead. So how does this all occur? Well, in 1909, Taft will call a special session of Congress because he wants to take up, one of the things that bothers him is tariff reform. And so he calls this special session of Congress, and he has a plan on how it's going to work. And within moments of Congress opening, he loses control. So instead of creating tariff reform, which would lessen the tariffs on goods coming into the country, instead, Congress actually increases the rates. And as a result, Taft's Republican Party members and the majority of the Americans were outraged because, of course, what that does is increase the cost of goods for the average person. Taft doesn't like the bill, but he signs it, and he will call it the best tariff law that the Republicans had ever enacted, because he's trying to gain favor with Congress, hoping that then they will then be supportive of his ideas as far as conservation and some other legislative goals he wants. By 1910, Taft is in trouble. He's wanting some reforms into the railroads and railroad regulations, and he wants to increase the Interstate Commerce Commission, their authority. Congress will oppose it. He's wanting a tariff reciprocity with Canada, so we don't charge anything for any things coming in from Canada. They don't charge for things coming in from us. The Democrats support it, but the Republicans don't. And then ultimately the Canadian Assembly will defeat it also. So the Republican Party leaders are absolutely determined in that 1912 election that Taft will not be reelected, and they are able to entice Roosevelt to run against him. What's really kind of interesting as you look at it, Taft is the favorite son, the Taft family in many ways, favorite family in Ohio, and yet Teddy Roosevelt will actually carry even Ohio. They were barely able to get a nomination for Taft from the Republican Party to be on the ticket. And then once convinced that the nomination had been stolen, Roosevelt believes that there was some miscounting in the back rooms. He will, of course, go out and organize his own progressive party, which is the Bull Moose Party. And that party will name him to run. And he chooses a guy by the name of Hiram Johnson, who is from California. So there's New York, California, a nice geographic division between presidents and vice presidential candidates. And they will run on that ballot. Interestingly, Taft's single objection in that 1912 campaign was to defeat Roosevelt. The real contest was who was going to control the progressive majority of the Republican Party. And they campaigned strenuously. Taft is calling for a new sense of nationalism. Roosevelt's talking about controlling big business through a stronger federal commission. He wants some radical tax reform, which would require that those who have much, remember prior to this, we do not have an income tax. He's wanting a whole series of measures that would put the federal government sort of in the business of social and economic reform. Wilson, on the other hand, is running on a program that he calls New Freedoms. He's opposed to monopolies. He wants to open doors for small businesses. He wants some tariff reduction. He wants some banking reform. He wants a tightening of the antitrust laws. And in some ways, he has taken up what had been the Republican Party's mantle. And when the votes are counted, Woodrow Wilson has won the election, but he's won with only 42% of the votes that were cast. And so that's going to set us up for some interesting sorts of things that will occur, because anytime that you are president and you're elected by less than a majority, you're going to find all sorts of difficult things that are going to be occurring. So let's take a look at the next slide and let's talk about some of the issues that are going to be really significant. So let's talk about some political reform. So one of the things that's so interesting as we begin to look, this issue of corrupt political machines had really begun to be concerning to those who paid attention to politics when we had the Panic of 1893. And we know that historically, about every 20 years, there will be some sort of a readjustment of the economy, a bit of a recession. If inflation becomes higher, there'll be some sort of new norming that begins to occur. Well, there was a panic in 1893, and the National Municipal League, which was formed in 1894, began to bring cities across the nation together to talk about how could they better manage cities? How could they make certain that if there was corruption in local government, it could be ousted? And they began to put in place political reforms so that you have corruption in New York really hitting the fan in 1894. A number of people will be removed from office. Baltimore, 1895, Chicago, 1896, 97, Chicago again in 1901. Chicago has sort of a difficult time, but by 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president, you're going to find this issue of urban political reform really kind of sweeping across the nation. And, political machines, you have big city machines like Tammany Hall. You have machines here, even in Tennessee, Memphis, the Crump machine during this period of time that carries on up for about 40 years or so in Memphis. It's this idea of reformers versus that political machine that controls who serves in each position in government. You campaign for the party, the candidates that the machine endorses, and then the payoff for that is patronage, and you get the jobs in the local government. One of the things they're concerned about too is looking at the cities and how are the cities taxing railroad and corporate property? Are they not taxing those things? How about tenement house reform? Especially in the larger cities where you have huge immigrant populations. What about schools? Are there free schools for all ages? And when does that begin to occur? And of course, we know that even here in Hamilton County, we have schools, but we don't have easy access to schools all the way through until the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century. Chattanooga City High School is the oldest four-year high school in the southeastern United States. Central High School is the oldest high school in the Chattanooga area, but it was originally formed as a three-year high school. But those schools are 1880s into the 1890s. So, for a long time, education was basically grades 1 through 4, grades 1 through 8. And only if you were affluent enough to be able to have access to high school did you go beyond. So that's a huge urban political reform issue too. The other thing that really rears its head during all of this is how is city government organized? A huge movement at the beginning of the 20th century to replace the old mayor city council arrangement where everyone runs, the mayor and all councilmen run citywide or in some cases countywide, depending on how local government is organized, and instead move to a commission form. Now, interestingly, some cities did that as early as the 19-teens. In the 1920s, there were cities that did not move to that commission form until much, much later. But that idea of commissioners who may be vested in a particular single department, that was one way that you could do it. The other was commissions where you have districts and each commissioner represents a district as opposed to everybody running across the entire city or county structure. All of it to attempt to bring government under control so that there's more direct responsibility to the voters. And the idea that some cities at this period of time began to talk about, instead of a mayor, having a city manager, so that you have someone who's professionally trained, who is an expert, who then is responsible to a popularly elected council. And those are both ways of being able to bring urban reform into it. At the same time, just real quickly, state governments, the reform movement spreads almost at once to the state level too, because the truth of the matter is that it's in the state capitals that most of the important decisions are going to be made, and those decisions made at the state level, of course, affect the cities and the counties, the cities and the, in some areas, it may not be structured by county, it may be in other ways, but those decisions made at the state level come down to the local level. What you find is by the 1890s, coming into that 20th century, you have a lot more people coming into government who are anti-organizational leaders. They're young, they're idealistic, they're wanting more of a voice for the people. So some of the names that you're probably familiar with from early 20th century history, the Robert La Follett's, the Charles Evans Hughes, the Woodrow Wilson's a good example coming out of New Jersey, Andrew Montague coming out of Virginia, Hiram Johnson, which I mentioned is Roosevelt's partner, coming out of California. A lot of these younger leaders revolutionized the whole idea of art and the practice of politics, exercising strong leadership, running political classes on how do you organize campaigns, how do you do direct primary elections. It's no surprise that it will be during this period of time that we will go from US senators being chosen by the state legislatures, which is what the US Constitution originally had as the method of how you chose your US senators. It will be during this period of the progressive movement that we'll go to the direct election of US senators. And it comes out of this sort of youthful reform movement. Trust the people, give the people the right to vote. The people can advocate for themselves. We are capable of self-government. Coming out of this, though, are going to be a lot of other reforms. So let's look at the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about prohibition. So, the idea of prohibition, the fact that temperance movements, whether we often think of temperance movements as being religiously based, but it also is the idea of not being totally and completely in control of what we're able to do, that alcohol changes personality. So the campaign against alcohol really had not made tremendous strides. There were always those people who were anti-drinking, always those people who were anti, hard liquor in particular, but it didn't make a lot of progress until 1893, when you have the Anti-Saloon League that is formed. And unlike previous groups that had come out of religious movements or whatever, the new organization, this anti-saloon law, focused its activities on prohibiting alcohol as opposed to persuading people just to stop drinking. Strong support for prohibition by the Protestant churches. It was probably the first single issue political campaign that the nation had seen. You would have those who were in favor of prohibition backing what they referred to as dry candidates for elected office. And the strategy works incredibly well, this single issue. We today know that there are certain single issue tags that will get people involved in political movements. Well, this is that first single issue movement. By 1917, 2/3 of the states had banned the production, the manufacture, and the sale of alcohol. What's interesting is prohibition will be aided by World War I. And it's kind of one of those funny things that you look at in history. But what you found were German Americans were prominent in brewing, and they were prominent in the distillery industries. And the US's involvement when we come into the war in 1917, remember 2/3 of the states have already banned the manufacture and the distribution of alcohol. We come into the Great War, World War I in 1917, and because we come in against Germany, it adds a patriotic flavor to Prohibition that called for a constitutional amendment on the production of alcohol. In December of 1917, Congress will adopt the 18th Amendment, and the 18th Amendment will be approved, ratified by all the states in January of 1919, and it goes into effect in January of 1920, which bans the manufacture, the sale, and the transportation of alcohol nationwide. It'll be short-lived. We'll come back and take care of this at a later time, but for right now, we're not going to be manufacturing, selling, or transporting, and especially across state lines, which then makes it a federal offense. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about child labor and women's labor and this idea of how are we going to protect those who are working. If one of the concerns progressives have is that those who are profiting from big business are operating without any checks. And interesting, if you go back, no one was particularly opposed to the idea that those who have investments in business should be able to reap profits, but they should not be able to do it without some consideration for the people who are working for them. So the National Child Labor Committee, beginning in the early 20th century, will coordinate a movement to address what they see as the exploitation of children. And one of their most effective weapons was they will take advantage of photography. There will be this huge national campaign using photographs taken by a guy by the name of Lewis Hines, wonderful photojournalist, who goes into factories and he photographs children in the working environment, and often in incredibly dangerous working situations. Photographs of children as young as 8 who are working in factories, textile plants, steel mills, working in mines, all these sorts of things. And by 1910, many of the states had enacted legislation that established a minimum legal age where children can work. And in most states at that point in 1910, it was between 12 and 16. You couldn't work if you were younger than that. And then there will be a movement toward what's the maximum work week? How long can they work each day, or how many hours can they work in one week? It's interesting. One of the things that we don't have good documentation that explains whether that had more of an impact on child labor, or whether the beginning of compulsory school attendance laws in some states had more of an impact. The fact that children had to be in school until a certain age, and the fact that they couldn't be in the workplace until they were a certain age sort of work together. Now, remember that compulsory mandatory school attendance for children wasn't, as it is today, to age 16. Instead, it was, for many, it was you stayed in school until you had graduated 8th grade, which in theory should be about the age of 12 or 14, depending on where you were going, and how they organized what they would call primary grades versus the advanced grades. But we begin to see that decrease. Part of what really helps with that movement too is you would find some of the industrial policies, and one that I remember standing out of my mind was one that came out of a textile mill in South Carolina, where they recommended that children be used actually in the most dangerous jobs, which was the untangling, like when thread would get tangled on the warp machines and things, that you use children, because in the event of an accident, a child had less value than did the adult workers, because they couldn't work the same, they didn't have the same level of technical skills, and they were not critical to providing for their families the way that the husband or the wife was, and therefore children were more expendable. And as those policies began to be carried in the muckrakers, the yellow journalist newspapers, enough people were shocked in seeing that sort of callous attitude toward children that there begins to be a change in the way that things are going to be done. And for women, you know, there was a concern too about how many hours women could work, arguing that long hours in a factory was detrimental to women's well-being. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1908, classic precedent case, Mueller versus Oregon, upheld a law in Oregon that said women laundry workers could work no more than 10 hours a day. In some places, women were expected in laundries to work 12 and 14-hour days. That case is really significant in constitutional law because what the court did for the very first time is that they accepted a brief, and it was a brief that was authored by Louis Brandeis, who himself will ultimately, he's an attorney, but will ultimately become a member of the court. But it was one of the first times ever that the courts really took a look at something that was not just based on precedent law, not just constitutional law straight, but he created a brief in which he had interviewed sociologists, economists. He submitted medical evidence demonstrating that long hours in the factories did indeed impair the health of women. And it also is supported by documentation of an event that had occurred in 1911. Some of you may remember this even from your American history, the shirtwaist triangle fire that occurs in New York City, in which almost 150, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrant women died in a factory fire. And part of that was because to keep them from taking breaks and everything, the doors to the factory had been by management padlocked to where they could not get out. In response to the Triangle Fire and to the Brandeis brief and the Mueller court decision and everything, there is a movement in New York to limit the number of hours that women can work to a 54-hour work week, and prohibited children under the age of 14 from working, period. And also, for the first time, building regulations and factory safety rules so that nothing like that fire would ever happen again. Next slide, I think is, yes, suffrage movement. You know, as you had people talking about political voices expanding the role of the citizen, if indeed we were looking at the fulfillment of the American dream and we were talking about equality and justice and humanity and all these sorts of things, well then, if women were capable of working, if women were employable outside the home, if they were the primary person responsible for the education, both from a faith standpoint, but also from an educational standpoint of children, then was it time to have equal opportunity for women in the political field? Now, obviously, that was a movement that had been going on for a long time, because Seneca Falls, we go all the way back to 72 years after the Declaration of Independence. Seneca Falls occurs in New York, where you have almost 300 people coming together, men and women both, sort of advocating for women's right to vote. Interestingly, here, what we're going to ultimately have will be the passage of the 19th Amendment, another 72 years exactly after the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, when we talk about suffrage, though, you have a number of the Western states had already granted the right to vote to women. Wyoming did it in 1890. Colorado had granted women the right to vote in 1893. Utah in 1896, and Washington State actually in 1910. And the Democratic Party platform in 1916 called for the remaining states to do the same. But there had not been a lot of success across the nation in being able to garner the right to vote for women. There were those who still believed that women were weaker than men and would not be able, one, either to form their own political opinion, or would, two, vote only the way in which their husbands told them, which did nothing more than sort of geometrically grow the vote, but didn't really change the outcomes. What you find is the National American Women's Suffrage Association becomes much more militant, and they will begin a lot of the marching. Now, the suffrage movements varied from state to state. What you will find in Tennessee, in fact, Chattanooga's Abby Crawford Milton was the first president of the Tennessee women's suffrage movement, but it was less of a militant movement and more of an educational movement, and certainly a lobbying movement and a political organization movement. Then you have, and it was much more similar probably to the Congressional Union, which was a national organization that was committed to gaining the right to vote through a constitutional amendment rather than securing it piecemeal, state by state by state, that there needed to be a national movement that would occur, that would be part of this overall reform movement. The National Women's Party used picket lines, they used marches, they used hunger strikes to try and build momentum. World War I, again, will help accelerate women's right to vote, because one of the things that was hard to argue with as men left to go be a part of that great American expeditionary force led by Black Jack, John J. Pershing, million man with then reinforcements coming, is that so many of the factory jobs, women began to work for the military and defense plants. They are involved in the Red Cross. They're actually participating and caring for those in the war. And it became very difficult to argue that they could not handle the pressure. Certainly they'd been working long hours in factories forever, but it became hard to argue that they couldn't maintain those sorts of organizations. The 19th Amendment, of course, to the Constitution, which gave the right to women to vote, will pass Congress in June of 1919, and it will be the final state necessarily for ratifying it in August of 1920 will be Tennessee. Tennessee will be the perfect 36, which was the 3/4 constitutional requirement. 48 states, 3/4 of them had to ratify. So 72 years after the Seneca Falls Convention, you have women earning the right to vote, and a move to a different, more involved. Now, was the work finished? Were the reform movements of the progressive era over? Of course not. There's always work to be done as far as looking at how do you find that balance between what most people would call progress, profit, and progressive caring for the people, and finding that right balance point. So you're going to see those sorts of movements constantly. The next major push will then be poll reforms, doing away with poll taxes, things that we will see that will continue to be arguments up until the 1960s and the 1970s, expanding the right to vote to Native Americans, looking at reform movements in things like women being able ultimately to serve on juries. In most states, women were not allowed to serve on juries until the 1970s. So, when we think about it, that's within most of our lifetimes that we see, while women's political rights, women will ultimately be elected to office, women will serve in the military. The political rights normally come first, and then from that will expand the societal rights that women will have because of that voice in government. But we're going to, constantly be looking at reform movements. And even today, there are still reform movements around. But so much of it begins with the progressive movement, and it begins with Teddy Roosevelt as president championing those progressive movements. And according to my clock, we are out of time, but we'll come back together next week. And we're going to be talking about the Great War. We'll talk about the Harlem Hellfighters, and we'll talk about Black Jack Pershing, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those heroic actions that occur and what it meant that the Yanks were finally over there, that forging of alliances that will continue with Britain and France. that are our allies even today. So Suzette, back to you.
Okay, well, does anybody have any questions or comments?
Or comments? Yes.
Okay, well, if not, as I said, we'll finish a little early today then, and you said we'll meet next week and do the Great War, World War One, and hope to see you all then.
Hope to see you then, and we'll keep you up to date on other things that we're doing historically. Mark May the 6th, 10:30 a.m. Broad Street. You need to come out for the longest continuous Armed Forces Day parade in the nation. That's my final plug to that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see you next week.
See everybody next week. Happy sunshine.